Hello everyone, my name is Foroozan. I'm a PhD student in Aerospace Engineering Research Group of the University Carlos III de Madrid. I'm proud to be here presenting my work virtually in APS2020 conference. Today I would like to present our recent research on data-driven dynamics description of a transitional boundary layer. This research challenges machine learning tools with the boundary layer transition theory to detect the regions of the transitional boundary layer flow automatically, and to describe the flow dynamics leading to the transition to turbulence. In recent years, the increasingly powerful tools in machine learning are leading to new approaches for rapidly analyzing complex datasets. The main aim is to provide algorithms that extract meaningful information from data that can be translated into knowledge. These techniques are well suited for high-dimensional and nonlinear problems, such as those encountered in fluid dynamics. The field of fluid dynamics nowadays is rapidly advancing in providing huge volumes of data from newly developed experimental setups or large-scale simulations, which gives rise to data spanning multiple dimensions over a wealth of spatiotemporal scales. The purpose of machine learning in the field of fluid dynamics is to provide accurate and efficient reduced order models that capture the essential dynamical features of fluid flows at a reasonable cost. To reduce the complexity of the information of such a numerical or experimental datasets, model analysis based on traditional machine learning tools, such as the proper orthogonal decomposition, has been widely exploited in fluid dynamics. In addition, in recent years, several other low-order modeling techniques have flourished and led to excellent applications to flow understanding and control. For instance, CROM identifies the principal mechanisms in an unsupervised manner directly from data. This method translates the nonlinear dynamics into a low-order linear model by assuming a probabilistic perspective of the system. Turbulent research among all subfields in fluid dynamics has widely progressed and pushed the capability of both experiments and numerical simulations to provide large datasets. The extreme separation of spatiotemporal scales in turbulent flows makes it exceedingly costly to resolve. Thus, it turns to a demanding field for machine learning to show up. In 2015, Professor Steven Brunton and his colleagues have done a comprehensive overview of machine learning methods used for the turbulence control. Transition to turbulence has important practical implications due to the enhanced mixing of momentum, high skin friction drag, and heat transfer rates associated with the onset of turbulence. Recent advances in computational and experimental capabilities have delivered new insights to reveal new scaling and universalities. But they are expensive for iterative operations and are often too slow for real-time control. There are many theoretical studies and theories of transition to turbulence in boundary layers. For example, slitting theory describes the stages in the process of transition in the boundary layer on a flat plate in the presence of an external flow turbulence intensity. These stages can be summarized as stable laminar flow, unstable laminar 2D flow waves, development of unstable laminar 3D waves, and vortex formation, bursts of turbulence in places of very high local vorticity, formation of turbulence spots in places where the turbulent velocity fluctuations are large, and coalescence of turbulent spots into a fully developed turbulent boundary layer. In this work, we aim to obtain an automatic, input-free domain partitioning technique to represent the stages of development of a transitional boundary layer. The availability of well-understood theories for the boundary layer transition makes it an excellent toy problem to explore the capabilities of machine learning to discover a flow theory, and also helps us to evaluate our approach. Here, we pursue an approach to mimic our mental process to model the flow behavior based on looking for patterns in the data. Unsupervised learning is particularly suited for this purpose. Accordingly, unsupervised learning methods such as clustering and multidimensional scaling reduction techniques Here, we pursue an approach to mimic our mental process to model the flow behavior based on looking for patterns in the data. Unsupervised learning is particularly suited for this purpose. Accordingly, unsupervised learning methods such as clustering and dimensionality reduction techniques are applied and evaluated in this work. Cluster analysis is a method from statistics and machine learning that aims to find hidden groups called clusters in data. Clustering partitions the data by introducing few representatives of the system that are used as a basis of the reduced order models. Although the k-means has been widely used in cluster-based studies in fluid mechanics applications, here we chose a variant of this algorithm called k-medoids, which follows the main procedure of k-means, but with a different prototyping. While k-means introduces the cluster centroid as the average of the observations assigned to each cluster, k-medoids selects the most centered observation belonging to the cluster as its prototype. This feature is advantageous for us since we are seeking to find a specific pattern as the representative of each cluster, which is not a meaningless average subject. In order to get a more traceable dataset and remove noisy and redundant features, we propose to reduce the dimensionality before clustering. Multidimensional scaling, or in short MDS, is a dimensionality reduction technique that maps a set of endpoints in an original p-dimensional space to a q-dimensional space where q is much less than p, given only a proximity map. Multidimensional scaling does not require any prior knowledge of the system behavior. It only expects a time-resolved sequence of observations and a problem-dependent definition of a distance measure. Once the observations have been classified into clusters, the dynamical behavior between different coherent states or clusters can be investigated using transition matrix model. It provides the transition of the observations from one cluster to another when advected downstream. This helps us to identify how the groups of observations in the domain belonging to the same cluster change. از اول بگم اینو؟ از اول؟
نه هم ترانزیشن ماتریکس
آخه میترسم موسه جاش عوض چیزایی بشه. بذار از اول اسلاید بگم. بالا پایین دادن اینم درد سر خودش باید بر بالا. Here we pursue an approach to mimic our mental process to model the flow behavior based on looking for patterns in the data. Unsupervised learning is particularly suited for this purpose. Accordingly, unsupervised learning methods such as clustering and dimensionality reduction techniques are applied and evaluated in this work. Cluster analysis is a method from statistics and machine learning that aims to find hidden groups called clusters in the data. Clustering partitions the data by introducing few representatives of the system that are used as a basis of the reduced order models. Although the k-means has been widely used in cluster-based studies in fluid mechanics applications, here we chose a variant of this algorithm called k-medoids, which follows the main process of k-means, but with a different prototyping. While k-means introduces the cluster centroid as the average of the observations assigned to each cluster, k-medoids selects the most centered observation belonging to the cluster as the prototype. This feature is advantageous for us since we are seeking for finding specific patterns as a representative of each cluster, which is not a meaningless average object. In order to get a more traceable dataset and remove noisy and redundant features, we propose a method to reduce the dimensionality before clustering. Multidimensional scaling, or in short MDS, is a dimensionality reduction technique that maps a set of endpoints in an original high dimensional space to a low dimensional one, given only a proximity matrix. Multidimensional scaling does not require any prior knowledge of the system behavior. It only expects a time-resolved sequence of observations and a problem-dependent definition of the distance measure. Once the observations have been classified into clusters, the dynamical behavior between different coherent states or clusters can be investigated using transition matrix model. It provides the transition of the observations from one cluster to another when advected downstream. This helps us to identify how the groups of observations in the domain belonging to the same cluster change their grouping in one time step in the future. In addition, to track the transition of cluster states in continuous time steps, we need to extract the pseudo-Lagrangian trajectory of observations in the cluster space. By means of cluster transition trajectories, the transition between these regions are modeled as a process which displays the graph of trajectories. We combine these ideas to develop our low-order model. To do so, the dataset of a numerical study of transitional boundary layer on a flat plate has been used. Since this is a data-driven approach, the model can be as informative as provided by the data. The basis of the dataset generated here is the transitional boundary layer database available in the Johns Hopkins and turbulence databases. It consists of a direct numerical simulation DNS of the incompressible flow over a flat plate with an elliptical edge, leading edge. The full simulation domain is shown here. The half thickness L of the plate and the incoming free stream speed are used as the references. The Reynolds number based on these references is 800. The length of the plate is 1000 L measured from the leading edge, and the width is 240 L. The free stream turbulence intensity is approximately 3% and at the leading edge, and slightly less than 0.5% at the outlet of the plate. To acquire the data, the streamwise velocity distribution on a streamwise-spanwise plane has been sampled. This sample has been done in several time instances. This plane has been placed sufficiently close to the wall to be representative of the wall shear distribution. This selected domain is then discretized into small size square cells 20L by 20L in the attempt to mimic the human process of classifying regions by inspecting subregions of the domain. The cell dimensions here is of the same order of magnitude as the boundary layer thickness in order to being large enough to capture significant flow structures and also small enough to guarantee a good mapping of the state, which means a sufficient number of cells. The data in each cell is captured with a spacing of 0.1 and then converted to a vector. The time spacing is chosen equal to the convected time to cross the cell with a convection velocity equal to free stream velocity. This choice is simplified, and the analysis since pseudo-Lagrangian dynamics of observations can be observed by simple streamwise shift of one cell for each snapshot in time. Consequently, the dataset is arranged into a significantly big matrix. The data analysis is carried out in two different frameworks. The first one is the kinematic analysis, in which we deal with the entire set of observations simultaneously to undergo the same treatment, independent of being captured at different time steps or not. In this section, the clustering process for the low-dimensional observation space is presented first. The cluster structure and related flow stages are then described, and an interpretation is given. The second framework is the dynamical analysis. مهمة. قطع بس بشه ولی معلومه بس. تابلو. The data analysis is carried out in two different frameworks. The first one is the kinematic analysis, in which we deal with the entire set of observations simultaneously to undergo the same treatment, independent of being captured at different time instants or not. In this section, the clustering process for the low-dimensional observations space is presented first. The cluster structure and related flow stages are then described, and an interpretation is given. The second framework is the dynamical analysis, which considers the evolution of each cluster during different time steps. By this means, we try to describe the temporal dynamics of the problem via a probabilistic network of transitions derived from the data. This part consists of cluster transition matrix and cluster transition trajectories. Reducing the dimensions of the data set makes us able to plot all the data points in a 2D MDS map like this. The coordinates of this map, gamma 1 and gamma 2, provide a useful interpretable tool to identify the characteristics of observations. To investigate these characteristics, some of the points along two axes are illustrated as samples. Here we can find the parameters that correlate well with gamma 1 and gamma 2. From visual inspections, it's clear that along horizontal axis, the samples are showing variance in the streamwise direction, which is an indicator of the turbulence. Also, there are two non-symmetric massive aggregations of points located along this axis. Along vertical axis, however, the high variance regions move in spanwise direction. To quantify these characteristics of the observations, we generated these two plots according to the spanwise profile of the streamwise variance inside each cell. Delta bar is the mean value of this profile, and Z star is the spanwise position of the center of area of this profile. Linear behavior of these two plots shows us the valuable correlation between the axes and these parameters. Thus, it can be stated that the computer has found two consistent metrics to classify important features without user input to do the same thing we would have done by eye. The symmetric distribution of the points in the later plot reinforces the data-driven hypothesis that gamma 2 relates directly to the asymmetry of the cells rather than to the transition process. I will come back to this later. After reducing the dimensionality of the problem, data clustering is performed on the low-dimensional space. To do so, the number of clusters, or K, must be set in advance. Since in this work we seek to process with minimal human intervention, we used elbow method empowered by the f-test, choosing a threshold of 0.9 for the variance explained in this method. So K is equal to 6. The corresponding medoids for these 6 clusters are visualized here, in which we can detect different structures inside them. This difference between their internal structures reveals different flow regimes. This figure shows the same distribution of points in the 2D map, color-coded with the value of the streamwise location on the flat plates. The cells that are located at the plate end or at the end of the plate are aggregated right in the middle of this plot. This figure confirms that gamma 2 is not related to the streamwise evolution of the structures, thus the transition process. In addition, the symmetrical configuration of the clusters further reinforces the data-driven hypothesis that gamma 2 relates directly to the asymmetry of the cells rather than to region recognition. Adding these results to what previously mentioned about the interpretation of gamma 1 and gamma 2, we shrink the 2D map by reflecting all the points to the upper half part of the map. Thus, clusters number 2 and 3 are now merged into one cluster, and the 5 medoid shapes like this. Here, we see the carpet of the reconstruction of the clustered full domain with clusters in different colors. This carpet contains the full spatial domain in every time step located below each other. We can clearly distinguish different stages of the transitional boundary layer flow from laminar, formation of turbulent spots, high velocity fluctuations, turbulent regions, and fully turbulent region. Here, we provided a matrix containing the probability of an observation transitioning from one cluster in columns to another cluster in rows within a given forward time step. It represents the dynamical change of state in the entire flow field. It can be seen that the second cluster plays a role as transition phase between the first one and the last 3, which are coupled and reveal the regions of high turbulence. For cluster 3, the probability is large for remaining in the same state, and thus it reveals that this state is the fully turbulent region. Also, distant matrix helps to discover the similarity between the clusters in terms of the distance parameter in the lower order space. This distance reconstructs the dissimilarity of the primitive cells. Here, again, the same configuration of clusters as the probability matrix can be seen. The group of 3 similar clusters are exactly the ones that have the most probability of transitioning between. To track the transition of cluster states in continuous time steps, we need to model the transition between these regions as a process, which displays the graph of the trajectories. Here, we assume that after one time step, each cell travels one step forward in space. With this assumption, the pseudo-Lagrangian tracking of the cells is captured from the leading edge to the end of the plate, and the most probable trajectories are determined. In contrast to the cluster transition matrix that captures all the possible movements in time, this graph captures just the ones that happen between 2 different clusters. However, the typical path is consistent with the cluster transition matrix, and the cells typically move from laminar to turbulent spots and finally to regions in the center, which is the most spatially homogeneous configuration, thus the fully developed turbulence. To conclude, we proposed a novel modeling strategy. To conclude, we proposed a novel modeling strategy that combines 2 unsupervised machine learning tools, each well-known in its own field. With this approach, we challenged machine learning tools or unsupervised machine learning tools to explore the capabilities of unsupervised learning to discover a flow theory. Applying clustering procedure on a 2D reduced order space significantly reduces the dimensionality of the problem and therefore the computational costs, while preserving the data structure in the state space. And the development of regions in transition boundary layer flow presents intermediate stages. The dynamics of the state transitions is described automatically, which are the laminar to turbulent transition in form of a Markov process. Thank you for your attention.